Alright, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Mings, and yesterday I dropped a video where I talked about everything Engage did right, and to balance out the positivity, here comes another one where I talk about the complete opposite. In today's video, I'm going to be listing all the things I feel Fire Emblem Engage got wrong, and I'm going to try and delve into a bit more detail than my other videos, because I think there's a lot of things to talk about here that are not commonly brought into the public area. I know there are some of you watching who love this game and doesn't like it when I critique it, but I challenge you guys to watch this video, and if you disagree with my points, respond with a comment telling me why I'm wrong. I'm always interested in hearing your opinions. So with that out of the way, let us begin listing the things Engage did wrong, starting with my first point, which is world building. World building is perhaps one of the most important aspects of any video game story. It is the canvas upon which everything else is painted. When you have a strong world, everything else becomes better by default. But when the world is weak, even the best written characters tend to feel shallow. For a world to be strong, it needs to feel like it could exist somewhere. It needs to have countries that make sense, it needs a history, a culture, it needs to have people living in it that feel organic and realistic. Without these things, it is hard to suspend our disbelief and really immerse ourselves into the universe. To make my point, I'm going to highlight one of my favorite worlds in Fire Emblem, Eleb, the world in which Fire Emblem 6 and 7 take place. Eleb genuinely feels like a real place. It has many countries, which makes geographical sense, and they're all distinct from one another. The Kingdom of Atrocious is one of the greatest, featuring many powerful and squabbling nobles who plot and scheme behind each other's backs. The country has a widespread religion in the St. Elamine Church and harbors both good and evil people alike, but it also colonizes various surrounding nations and steals resources from them. Meanwhile, you have the Lycian League to the south, which is made up by many dukedoms who often clash with each other, but still come together as one when they're threatened by the outside. To the east, you have the Dragon Kingdom of Bern, where the strong Wyvern Riders dominate the sky due to its mountainous terrain. Then north of that, you have the nomadic people of Sakai, who live on plains with various clans warring amongst each other. And then even further north, you have the frozen country of Ilia, where people make their living working as mercenaries and sellswords. In the southwest, you have the desert nation of Arcadia, which is mostly barren, but does feature some mystical places like the dragon village of Nabata. You also have the Western Isles, which are rich in minerals, but also suffer greatly under Arturia's colonization. In Fire Emblem 6, you see Roy traveling around visiting each of these nations, and what I love about this game is that it always takes some time to explain the backstory of each nation when you are about to enter into it. It explains how the people make their living, and some general tidbits about the nation's culture, and also what their relationship with the surrounding nations is. All of this combined with the rich history of the continent, which features significant events like the Scouring, where humans fought dragons in a war for survival, makes Eleb feel like a place that could actually exist. Each of these nations have a distinct feel to them, and they're all memorable in their own ways. Now, let's take a look at the continent of Elyos. The first thing we see is that it's ring-shaped, because Engage lacks any subtlety at all. The first continent we're introduced to is Lithos, where the Divine Dragon wakes up for the first time. We don't spend a lot of time in Lithos, it effectively serves as the tutorial of the game. But I have just one question. Who lives here? Over the course of Engage, we meet the three retainers, Vander, Fram, and Cram, who are all part of an organization tasked with watching over the Divine Dragon. And then we meet Lumera, Alir's mom. And that's about it. Are there villages in Lithos? Do regular people live there? Or is it a nation housing literally 5 people? We are never told anything about this mystical nation that floats in the center of Elyos. There is nothing about its culture, its relationship with the other surrounding areas, or how people even get there. Lithos just kinda exists as a place to gather the Emblem rings, and that's it. It feels as empty and desolate as Vala did in Fire Emblem Fates. But at the very least, Vala had the excuse of being a broken nation. Before Anankos did his thing, it was a place filled with people. Lithos has no such excuse. Then we have the surrounding nations, Faerun, Brodia, Elucia, and Solm. 4 nations whose gimmicks can be explained in one simple sentence. Faerun is a country where people like wearing fashionable clothes and drink tea. Brodia is a country where people like to lift weights and fight. Elucia is the country where people worship the Dark Dragon and dress like clowns. Solm is a desert nation where people are carefree and like freedom. Do each of these nations have their distinct different religions? No, with the exception of Elucia, they all pretty much worship the Divine Dragon as a god. Are the Emblem rings intrinsically tied to their cultures? Not really. Do they have ties with each other? Sort of. Brodia fights with Elucia a lot because they don't like each other, but that's pretty much about it. Now, here's a challenge. Can you name a couple of historical events? A few important battles, maybe? Talk about some past rulers? Can you tell me how people live their lives in Elyos? What's the fundamental differences between the countries? Go ahead, take your time, because the answer does not exist, because they were never provided to us. The world building of Engage isn't just shallow, it simply does not exist. Aside from a few baseline sentences about each nation, we are never given any real substance to sink our teeth into. By comparison, Engage's predecessor, Three Houses, featured an entire library of books explaining the detailed history of Fodlan, from wars to significant events to family trees and much, much more. Engage does not do this. They couldn't even bother putting in the slightest bit of effort into their world building, and that makes everything else in this game feel hollow and pointless. But there are so many other problems with Engage aside from just a lack of world building. First of all, the geography of Elios doesn't make sense. Why is the Desert Nation located between the Cold Nation and the Temperate Plains? Sure, it is a fantasy world, but it should still make as much sense as possible. Also, how come the two nations which fight a lot only share a tiny sliver of a border in the north that could easily be made inaccessible with a bunch of walls and forts? Even worse are the royal families. How come every single one of these nations is ruled by either a single king or queen? We have exactly 2 kings, 2 queens, who all have 2 children with 2 retainers, all roughly around the same age. This feels like a blatant copy pasta, like each nation was designed from a preset template. It makes the world feel artificial and fake, and contributes even further to making you feel detached. And when it comes to feeling detached, that brings me to my next point, which is the dialogue. There is something incredibly unsettling about Engage's dialogue. The more I view it, the more I'm baffled that this was work done by actual humans. Sometimes I am genuinely curious whether they outsourced some part of the writing of this game to ChatGPT. However, I also think that the localization is partly to blame for the atrocious dialogue in this game. Personally, I think that one of Engage's major issue is that it has a very Japanese sort of humor, and this kind of humor just doesn't translate well to other languages. The scene in which Alchrist is introduced sees him running towards the protagonist at max speed, seemingly wanting to kill them, before jumping into the air, landing on his knees, and apologizing profusely. This is a scene that I could easily see existing in some kind of quirky anime. It is very Japanese. This kind of humor works for a Japanese audience because it is just sort of their style, but when translated to English, and any other language for that matter, it just turns cringe. I think a big overarching problem with Engage in general is that the humor is just very niche. Granted, there are some decent interactions in Engage, and even some very good supports hidden among the rough, but they are covered in so much cringe-inducing dialogue and horrible writing that it's hard to find them. Personally, I find myself skipping most of the optional dialogue just because I couldn't be bothered sitting through so much cringe, and that made me miss out on the few bits of good dialogue this game actually has. And that brings me over to the next point, which is the villains. While I already have pointed out the cheesy dialogue in my previous point, I feel like the villains of Engage need a dedicated segment because my goodness, they are some of the worst ones I've seen in the series thus far. Fire Emblem has always had cheesy and wacky villains in the past. The other games were full of ugly brigands, comically evil nobles, and just outright silly characters. But Engage's villains feels like a parody of a parody. They monologue excessively, giving away their plans when they absolutely should not have to. They let the players escape from certain death scenarios multiple times, and for a majority of the game they just feel like they are evil for the sake of being evil. Until of course their death scene arrives and the game tries super hard to make them sympathetic by dragging out those scenes way longer than they should. It's like the writers of Engage have seen how much the community loves a sympathetic villain, so they decided to try and make us feel bad about killing them in the very last moment. There are many examples of this, but Sephia and Griss's death scene is by far the worst offender. Writing just doesn't work this way. For a villain to be sympathetic, you need to set them up to be so beforehand, but nothing about Engage signifies that they had any kind of foresight with these characters at all. They are simply written to be obstacles for the players to overcome, and then their motivation seems to simply be either, I serve the Dark Dragon, or haha, it sure is funny being evil. There are some great characters in this game like Mauvier, who is very clearly set up to not be evil from the start, but then the game never takes its time to explain to the player what the hell he is doing hanging out with the rest of the 4 hounds in the first place. If he's truly not evil like they are, what the hell is he doing mingling with these clearly evil people? There are ways to cleverly write a character like Mauvier into a group like this. Maybe he's there because of blackmail, for example. But Engage doesn't bother to even do the most rudimentary of setups for this. In fact, the Four Hounds are so poorly executed as a group that it boggles the mind. It's clear that the writers of Engage saw the Four Fangs from Fire Emblem 7 and really wanted to copy them. A team of villains can be a very cool concept if it's done well, but it's tricky to write such a group well because evil people, generally speaking, do not value friendship and seldom trust each other. A group like the Four Hounds, who are just seemingly evil for the sake of being evil, needs some kind of motivation to hang out and fight together. And as far as I can remember, we are never given any. They're just kind of serve Lord Sombron because he's the Dark Lord, and that's pretty much about it. We don't get any backstory on how the group was formed, why they stick together, or even what kind of relationship they have with one another. The group dynamic they have is all over the place. Steffi and Gris seems to be close, as are Mauvier and Marnie. Why does Mauvier get all protective about Marnie? We don't really know, it's never explained, and what bothers me is that it would have been so easy to just make up a reason for why. Let's say that Mauvier had a daughter who he lost in battle, and Marnie reminds him of that daughter, and that's why he's protective of her. Just like that, I've given his character a little bit of depth, and now his actions actually make sense. But the writers of Engage couldn't even be bothered to do something simple like this. The same can be applied to Sephia and Gris's relationship. Why are they so close? We don't know. The game never tells us. How about just saying that they used to be lovers? Maybe Sephia really wanted a baby, but was unable to have one with Gris since he's human, and this now explains why she's so hell-bent on serving Sombron. Speaking of Sephia, she is probably the worst of the Four Hounds, because the story can't seem to make up its mind about her. She goes back and forth from being comically over-the-top evil to being sympathetic with seemingly no explanation given whatsoever. In one moment, she's literally killing a child. In another, she talks about how badly she wants a baby. It's like the game can't decide what she is. I also think it's funny that she's depicted as a dragon, but we never once see her actually take draconic form. I guess they didn't have the budget to give her one. Like, she's just a human all the time, and then she dies as a human. Like, if she's a dragon, why the hell doesn't she turn into one? Come to speak of it, Alir and Vale doesn't really ever transform either, despite being classified as dragons. Feels kinda weird. I kinda thought they'd reveal their true forms towards the end of the game, but it just never happens. And yeah, on the topic of Vale, I don't really have much to say here either, because the plot is literally just mind control. She's being controlled. She's not evil, she's just being forced to be evil by Sombron. And that is an incredibly boring way to write a character. Sure, mind control has been used in past Fire Emblem games, and I wasn't a fan of it then either, but Vale gets so much screen time, and the game works so hard to try and make you like her. But having the mind control be the main part of her character arc just makes her so uninteresting. If Vale instead had been an evil character and we were able to turn her good through our interactions, that would have actually been interesting, and it would have fit with the whole theme of Engage, which is friendship overcoming solitude. Instead, saving Vale comes down to shattering a literal mind control placed on top of her head by Sombron. It is not exciting, it doesn't engage the player or feel meaningful, and when Vale goes over to the good side, it doesn't feel earned, which sucks. And that is just a recurring problem with Engage's villains. They are either generic, cheesy, or boring. And I would argue that a Fire Emblem game's story is only as good as its villain. While I don't think that a good antagonist could have necessarily saved the story of Engage, it certainly could have made it more bearable. And oh yeah, I haven't really talked about Sombron in this segment because I don't really have anything to say. He's just a really generic evil black dragon who went emo because his emblem left him. And while a generic evil antagonist can sometimes work if the rest of the game is solid, you need a strong cast of supporting villain characters and good writing around such an antagonist if they are to be satisfying. And Engage does not have any of that. And speaking of characters, that brings me over to my next point, which is everything about Alir. The various Fire Emblem games have all committed their own share of cardinal sins over the years. But if there's one thing they always nailed, it was the character designs. They never missed. Not until Engage. What is there to say about Alir's design that hasn't already been said 1,000 times? It is just awful. There is no redeeming this. The contrasting blue and red color scheme seems to have been inspired by other popular lords in the series, such as Roy and Eliwood. And while blue and red can work great together, this is not the way you do this. Even if it wasn't for the horribly contrasting colors and the multicolored hair, the rest of Alir's design is just terrible. The weird shoes, the weird pants, the straps that go everywhere. Everything about this character just looks wrong, as if someone hit the randomize button in a character creation screen. And loath as I am to say it, Alir's design is not even the worst part about this character. My biggest criticism of Alir is that they are just a lazy avatar, a trope that begun with Byleth and Tree Houses, although I don't think Byleth came anywhere near this level of awful. Avatars, as much as I hate their existence, are there so people can project their own persona into the world they're part of, and feel a special bond with the characters around them. In order to not break immersion, they need to act like neutral blank slates, and that's fine, but it does mean that their characters can never be overly interesting. However, it is also in your best interest that their design isn't terribly flashy. Previous designs like Robin got this just right. Male and female Robin, while very pretty and attractive characters, resemble what you'd expect a generic tactician to look like. The hood is a very nice touch. And say what you will about Corrin, at least Corrin's name and appearance could be customized, and you can have them be any class you wanted. If you're going to have an avatar, at the very least you should be able to customize them. But Alir isn't even viable in most classes in the game due to a horrible magic growth and base. And while Byleth at the very least was smart enough to shut up so you could try and immerse yourself a little bit in the character, Alir has fully voice acted dialogue, which means that you get the worst of both worlds. You don't really get to customize them, and they are also the main character and talk in every scene, which means you don't get to project yourself into their shoes. I honestly wonder if it's even fair to call Alir an avatar. They're more like a main character that you can change the name and gender of. So I ask, why even bother? Why not just make an actual character to take their place, like Diamant for example? And of course, no avatar is complete without the constant avatar worship, where every character who comes within 100 feet of you have to constantly jerk you off and proclaim how amazing you are. Avatar worship was a problem in the previous games, but Engage takes it a step further by making you the literal religion of Elios, and having people treat you like a freaking celebrity every time they see you. It's like the writers of Engage saw the previous complaints about avatar worship and simply gave us the middle finger. Oh, you think it's cringe when people worship you? Well, we're going to make them worship you in a literal sense, because you're the god of their goddamn universe now. I sometimes see people trying to defend the avatar worship of Engage by saying that, yeah, of course people would react like that upon seeing the divine dragon. It is their literal deity. And that is the problem. It is not so much that the characters react the way that they react, it's more that the writers of this game wrote the character to be a god to begin with. I actually think it's spectacular how much Alir failed as a main character. It's like they were playing awful avatar bingo and aced every single column. Terrible design? Check. No customization? Check. Annoying personality? Check. Avatar worship? Check. Unless the next Fire Emblem game is an even more stinky pile of garbage, I think Alir will go down in history as the worst avatar to have ever existed. And now that I'm done crapping on the avatar, it's time for me to move over to my next point, which is the rest of the casts. To prove my next point, I'm going to ask you a few questions. After you are done with Fire, what does Alfred do in the game? And after the Brody arc, does Diamant have any impact on the plot? After the Soul Mark, what exactly is Tamara's role in the story? Actually, what is Tamara's role in the story in the Soul Mark, aside from singing a stupid meat song? Or what about Ivy once her subplot with Hortensia is resolved? The answer is nothing. These so-called main characters are delegated to just standing around in the background, chipping in with a one-liner every now and then. And honestly, the same can be said about the emblems. Sigurd and Marth are by far the two emblems that get the most dialogue, while the rest of them hardly have any lines at all. I know firsthand how hard it can be to develop side characters in a Fire Emblem game, as many of them lack any lines in the main story itself, aside from support conversations. And it really is difficult to have characters who can die and not be present in a story have an important impact on the plot, as that requires the devs to effectively develop backup scenes in case they are not present. But Engage is so lazy about developing its side characters that I feel like it would be better if they were not there at all. I feel like you could take Alfred, Diamant, Tamara, and Ivy out of the game completely and just have it be Alir and Vale. Speaking of characters though, let's move over to my next point, which is retainers. I miss the time when your army was a mixture of royalty, nobility, and commoners, all fighting under the same banner. Some of your units were kings, queens, princes, and princesses, while others were random scrubs you recruited from the enemy army. To its credit, Engage didn't start this trend. Fates was by far the worst culprit, but it certainly continued it in a very annoying way. Aside from a few very rare characters like Linden and Saphir, almost every single playable character in Engage is either royalty or a retainer of said royalty, and those retainers always come in pairs for some reason. Personally, I just want to do away with the concept of retainers altogether. It's such a lazy way to design a cast and give them a motivation to stick around. And on the subject of the casts, I do have to address the elephant in the room in my next point, which is The character designs. If you watched my other video where I praise Engage, you will know that there are designs in the game that I genuinely think deserves more recognition and praise, but that is the exception, not the rule. While I know that many of the things I'm about to say have already been said a million times, I still can't make a video like this without bringing up the atrocious character designs of this game. I've already briefly talked about Alir, so I'm not going to repeat my Colgate jokes, and I also know things like Ivy's barbecue lid have been brought up countless times. So instead, I'm going to try and focus on some points which I feel don't get enough attention. I think there is an argument to be made that there's more than just poor decision making behind Engage's designs. I actually think there was very little effort and potentially a low budget to blame for many of the game's design decisions, and I'm going to back up my statement with some interesting material. Here is a transparent picture of all of Engage's female characters overlaid on top of each other. Do you notice something interesting here? Despite the myriad of different hairstyles and clothes, they all have the same identical face. It seems to me like every single character in Engage was designed from the same basic template, making them all appear very samey. I believe that to counteract this sameness, the designers decided to deck out their characters with a million accessories in order to make them stand out from each other, and I think this is the main culprit behind the obnoxious VTuber design of Engage. The fact that each character was not drawn from scratch, but was made using a basic template, meant they had to compensate for the lack of variety by using trinkets, and this is why every single character in this game feels so over-designed. It's the design equivalent to putting a potted plant over a stain on your carpet to hide it, except that Engage effectively put 100 potted plants in the living room to cover up the lack of an entire floor. In addition to this blatant design flaw, Engage's characters have a stiffness to them that makes them appear robotic and artificial. This is very apparent when it comes to the hair of the female characters, which is just so stiff and unmoving, but even more so when it comes to their boobs. Engage has a lot of cleavage in it, which some people like, myself included. But what stops me from appreciating it is that most of the female characters in this game appear like they have rock-hard, unmoving silicone boobs from the 90s Playboy era. If you're going to give me tits, at least make them move around a little. Even Fates understood this when they gave us Camilla. More than anything though, it appears to me like they either got lazy or were hardly trying with many of these character designs. Take the character of Eddie. Her entire gimmick is that she works out a lot and likes muscles, a trait we've seen in past characters like Raphael and Effie. But Eddie generally do not feel like she belongs in this category. Her in-game statistics certainly do not reflect this. She's an archer, a class that has historically been associated with weak, agile characters. She only has a 40% strength growth, and furthermore, a base build of 4, with a 5% build growth. Build is the whole premise of her character, and yet she hardly ever grows it. And this is supposed to be the muscle character of this game? If you ask me, Eddie was never meant to have this gimmick. In fact, if you look closely at her design, her dress appears to be cut off. I personally have a theory that Eddie was going to have a completely different gimmick, but was changed last minute to be a muscle character because it was a trait they missed from the main roster. So they took this character, cut her dress, painted abs on her to make her fit the role. I know this is just a theory, but even if I am wrong, there is just something very weird with the whole portrayal of this character. It's like the developers are just taking the piss, which they also did in my next point, which is personal skills. Personal skills are, in my opinion, one of the best ways to reinforce individuality among characters. It can enhance their gimmicks and truly make them stand out. Take a character like Dedu in Tree Houses, who is known for being a towering bulwark of a man. Would he have felt anywhere near as good if he didn't have that insanely overpowered +4 defense when waiting personal skill that just makes him shrug off blows in the early game? No, he wouldn't. Strong personal skills can make some characters feel amazing, but sadly, Engage just decided to make 90% of them completely worthless. I've said before that I don't mind some imbalance between characters, and I think it's understandable that as the main character, Alir gets one of the best personal skills in the game. But why oh why does almost every other personal in this game feel like a complete waste of space? Wow, a luck percentage chance to get another lunch. Thanks, Bonnet, that sure makes a difference in battle. Or how about Eddie getting +4 strength after using a vulnerary on enemy face? As an archer. Yeah, I know she can reclass, I don't care, it still sucks. Oh yeah, speaking of vulneraries, how about Citrine giving half of hers to adjacent units when she drinks one? Who the hell cares? These skills are garbage. They have zero impact on the game, and they might as well not be there. If you're going to have personal skills in the game, can you at least make them situationally viable? I have no idea why Engage went down this route of just making the personal skills so useless they might as well be flavor text. It's not like they care about balance, because half of the emblems in this game can break it into pieces. So I don't understand why they simply couldn't assign more personal skills similar to what Dedue had in Tree Houses. It feels like a waste of space and just seems pointless. Like my next point, which is the DLC. I know I'm going to get the same comment a million times after this point, and that is, DLC is optional. If you don't like it, don't buy it. But just because something is optional, does that mean people can't criticize it for being awful? In a sense, buying the game is also optional. No one is going to force you to play it, so I feel like it's completely fair to show the same level of scrutiny towards the optional content. Now, granted, DLC has historically never been great for Fire Emblem. Ever since it was introduced, it has always felt like a cheap cash grab, and much of the content has been pretty lazy, with a few exceptions. But the DLC of Engage takes it to a new level. I can't comment much on the story as I didn't really play it. I just watched a few streamers torture themselves through it as background noise. But one thing that is blatantly obvious to me is that the DLC was hardly tested at all. On the lower difficulties, it was just a breeze. On the highest difficulty, it felt horribly overtuned. But the most insulting part of the DLC to me is that you have to play it every single time you do a new game to get the optional character, which is just so stupid. In my opinion, clearing it once should just unlock all of its benefits for consecutive playthroughs. No one wants to clear the DLC multiple times to get stuff. I also dislike how much of a power spike the DLC is. It turns maddening mode into easy mode, to the point where it doesn't really feel like you're playing the game anymore if you take advantage of it. I really wish that future Fire Emblem DLC was more about just expanding the content and adding more replayability to the main game, rather than adding these crappy side stories which no one cares about. I suppose as long as we keep buying it, they're going to continue pumping it out, which is a shame. Anyway, this video is getting quite long, so I'm going to wrap it up with my final point, and the main thing I felt Engage did wrong, which is, it doesn't feel like Fire Emblem. More than any other point, there is one thing I feel detracts from Engage, and that is that it feels hollow and soulless. It just doesn't feel like Fire Emblem. This is a massive franchise spanning a ton of games. Some have been great, others have been mediocre, but the one thing that Fire Emblem has always nailed is its identity. Once that music kicks in and you see armor knights, Pegasus riders, bishops and sages, snipers and swordmasters clash together with a dragon flying overhead, you know that you are playing a Fire Emblem game. Engage is the first time in the series where I genuinely feel alienated as a longtime fan. It doesn't feel like Fire Emblem. Rather, it feels like a bootleg game masquerading as one. The graphics are more akin to Genshin Impact, and they feel very cartoonish and childish. At the time of making this video, it's been roughly 1.5 years since Engage came out, and I still feel pretty much the same way about it as I have for a while. It does have its strong points, which I pointed out in yesterday's video, but overall my feeling towards it remains very negative. Anyway, that's all I have to say about Engage and what it did wrong. Do you agree or disagree with any of my points? Feel free to roast me in the comment section. And again, if you want to hear what I actually liked about this game, you can go check out this video in front of you. My name is Mengs, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.